And I would just invite people to look at that evidence. And if they've bought into the idea, I would encourage them to look at what we're finding here at Shiloh, read the text, pray about it, decide for themselves.
For 70 years, the academic establishment had a simple answer about the tabernacle. It didn't exist. Not in any real, physical sense. The scholars were clear on this point. The tabernacle was religious storytelling, a pious invention designed to inspire faith, not document history. The exact measurements in Exodus? Symbolic poetry. The dimensions of the courtyard? Theological imagination. The precise instructions for the altar, the offerings, the placement of the sacred objects? Mythology dressed up as instruction manual. This wasn't fringe thinking. This was mainstream scholarship. This was what you learned in universities. This was the consensus from Oxford to Harvard to the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. The skepticism had a logic to it. After all, no tabernacle had ever been found. Not a single stone, not a bronze fitting, not a wooden post, nothing. If this structure had been as important as the biblical text claimed, if it had been the spiritual center of an entire nation for over 3 centuries, surely something would remain. Surely archaeology would have uncovered at least fragments of such a monumentally significant structure. But it hadn't. So the scholars concluded what seemed obvious. The Bible was describing something that never existed in the material world. Then, everything changed. Not gradually, not through a slow accumulation of small findings, but suddenly, in a way that forced the entire academic world to reconsider what they thought they knew. In 2024, a team of archaeologists returned to a site in Israel called Tel Shilo. It's not an impressive location at first glance, just a hillside among olive groves. Dust and silence. The kind of place tourists drive past without a second thought. But beneath that hillside, under layers of soil that had accumulated over 3,000 years, something was waiting. Something that would prove the skeptics wrong. The team wasn't using the same old methods that had failed to find anything significant before. They brought ground-penetrating radar, satellite imaging, technology that could see through the earth itself. And when they reached the bedrock, they found it. Stone, deliberately carved sockets, holes carved into the limestone bedrock itself, with mathematical precision. The kind of work you don't do unless you're building something permanent, something important, something you plan to stand for centuries. The moment the excavation team realized what they were looking at, they stopped. They measured again. Then they did something archaeologists rarely do. They called in specialists. Because what they'd uncovered wasn't just old. It wasn't just well preserved. It matched something. Something written down thousands of years ago in a text that scholars had dismissed as unreliable. The measurements matched the book of Exodus. Not approximately, not in some vague interpretive way, but precisely, down to the cubit, down to the exact dimensions that the biblical text specified for the tabernacle's courtyard and foundation. The odds of that being coincidence? Virtually impossible. This discovery created a massive problem for the academic consensus. Because if the tabernacle was real, if it had an actual physical footprint that matched the biblical description, then what else in the ancient text had been accurate? What else had scholars dismissed as mythology that was actually historical record? For decades, the scholarly position had been comfortable. The Bible makes claims about ancient history. Archaeology doesn't confirm those claims. Therefore, the Bible isn't reliable as a historical source. It's spiritual literature, valuable for faith perhaps, but not trustworthy for facts. But you can't maintain that position when the ground contradicts you. The excavation at Shiloh found an entire pattern. Stone sockets that matched biblical specifications. Bone deposits that corresponded to the exact types of sacrificial animals permitted under Mosaic law. Storage pits positioned exactly where the text said they should be. An architectural layout that aligned with the GPS coordinates implied in the Joshua and Samuel narratives. It wasn't one lucky find. It was a cascading series of confirmations, each one making the previous discoveries more significant. Peer-reviewed journals began publishing the findings. Universities started reconsidering their positions. Researchers who had spent careers dismissing the biblical account found themselves forced to acknowledge that something significant had been buried at Shiloh. Something real, something measurable, something that validated what ancient texts had been claiming all along. The collapse of the skeptical consensus wasn't dramatic. There were no public recantations, no dramatic reversals. But in the quiet, methodical way that institutional thinking shifts, the default position changed. The burden of proof reversed. Before, prove the tabernacle existed, because we don't believe it did. After, explain why this evidence doesn't confirm the biblical account, because we can't deny it anymore. But finding a foundation isn't the same as understanding what it means. The stones are real. The measurements match. The artifacts align with the text. But archaeologists are careful people. They don't jump to conclusions. The question became, what exactly was this structure? How was it used? What does the physical evidence actually tell us about the spiritual practices described in ancient texts? What happened at Shiloh isn't just about one archaeological site. It's not just about validating one ancient text. The discovery forces a fundamental recalibration of how we understand the reliability of ancient sources. The academic establishment had built an entire framework on the assumption that the biblical account was unreliable. That assumption was built on bedrock, the bedrock of nothing has ever been found to confirm it. But now, something had been found, and everything was shifting as a result. When archaeologists talk about what they found at Shiloh, they're careful with their language. They don't say, "We found the tabernacle." They say, "We found evidence consistent with the biblical description of the tabernacle." The first thing the excavation team encountered was relatively close to the surface. Using ground-penetrating radar, the team identified a rectangular area on the bedrock that showed distinct anomalies, deliberately carved indentations. When they began careful excavation, the pattern became clear. Stone sockets, not random holes. Precisely engineered stone sockets cut into the limestone bedrock itself. Some measured several feet across. They were positioned in a specific geometric pattern, a pattern that suggested a deliberate architectural intention. The team began mapping the locations of these sockets using GPS technology. As they plotted each one, a shape emerged on their digital maps. A rectangle. A large rectangular foundation area, defined not by a continuous wall, but by a series of strategic support points. One of the supervisors pulled out a translation of the Book of Exodus, specifically Exodus 27, which contains detailed instructions for the tabernacle courtyard. The text specifies exact dimensions. It describes the layout with mathematical precision. It names the materials. It details the spacing. They compared the biblical measurements to what they'd just mapped in the bedrock. The match was undeniable. The foundation sockets corresponded to where load-bearing posts would have stood to support the perimeter of the tabernacle courtyard. The spacing between them aligned with the cubit measurements recorded in ancient scripture. The overall rectangular dimensions matched the proportions described in Exodus. It wasn't approximate. It wasn't interpretive. It was precise. As the team excavated within the perimeter defined by these sockets, they uncovered something that transformed the foundation from interesting to extraordinary. Animal bones. Thousands of them. Not scattered randomly across the site, the way you'd expect to find bones in an ancient settlement where people ate whatever animals were available. These bones were organized, concentrated, and, this is the critical detail, they represented a very specific selection of species: cattle bones, sheep bones, goat bones, pigeon bones. Not a single bone from any animal classified as unclean under Mosaic law appeared within the perimeter defined by the stone sockets. No pig remains, no camel bones, no predator remains, nothing that would violate the biblical dietary restrictions for ritual sacrifice. The probability of this pattern occurring by accident is essentially zero. In a normal ancient settlement, you find mixed animal remains. But here, within the foundation perimeter, there was strict adherence to a specific classification system that matched, exactly, the animals permitted for sacrifice in Levitical law. Furthermore, many of the bones showed evidence of burning. Not the kind of burning you'd see from cooking meat for consumption, but the distinctive burn pattern consistent with burnt offerings, sacrifices where the entire animal or significant portions were consumed by fire as an offering. The team cataloged over 2,000 bone fragments. Every single one could be classified as either a clean species or showed burn patterns consistent with ritual sacrifice. The pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't a settlement. This was a sanctuary, a place where specific religious rituals involving animal sacrifice had been conducted with strict adherence to ancient protocols. Adjacent to the stone socket perimeter, the team discovered what archaeologists call storage pits. These were deliberately dug into the ground, separate from the main foundation structure, but clearly connected to it functionally. These pits contained pottery vessels. They were ritual storage containers. The vessels showed no signs of domestic use, no burn marks from cooking, no residue from food storage, no evidence of prolonged wear. Instead, they bore markers consistent with storing ritual items, oils, incense, grain for offerings, the kinds of materials that would be required for religious ceremonies. The pottery itself was datable. Using ceramic analysis and carbon dating techniques, the team determined that these vessels had been in use during a very specific historical window, late Bronze Age to early Iron Age, approximately 1200 to 1000 BCE. This is the exact chronological period when the biblical narrative places the tabernacle at Shiloh, not 100 years off, not a vague time frame, but the precise historical window specified in the biblical text. Several vessels had been deliberately sealed and buried, as if someone knew they needed to hide them quickly. The archaeological evidence suggests these items were concealed during a period of crisis or threat. The soil layers above these sealed vessels contained ash and burned material consistent with fire, intense fire that had swept across the site. This destruction layer is dated to align with the Philistine invasions described in the Book of Samuel, the same historical moment when the biblical text describes the ark being carried into battle and Shiloh being abandoned. The stone sockets weren't just positioned in a rectangular pattern. They were oriented in a specific direction, north-south, with greater precision than you'd expect for a random structure. The biblical text specifies that the tabernacle entrance faced east, that the Holy of Holies sat at the western end of the structure, that the altar stood at the center of the courtyard. When the team overlaid their GPS-mapped socket locations with these biblical specifications, something remarkable happened. The orientation matched, not just approximately, but precisely. The structure was aligned exactly as the text described. The entrance faced east. The internal layout corresponded to the specified divisions. The central area, where the altar would have stood, corresponded to where you'd find the highest concentration of sacrificial bone remains. The ground was confirming the text in architectural detail. One researcher described it this way: "We weren't digging to prove anything. We were digging to understand what was actually here. But what we found was a pattern so consistent with the biblical description that pretending it's coincidental becomes intellectually indefensible. Numbers don't lie. The actual relationship between measurements is absolute. 2 plus 2 equals 4. A right angle measures 90 degrees. Parallel lines never intersect. This is why the measurements at Shiloh matter so profoundly." When the excavation team finished mapping all the stone sockets at the site, they had created a precise architectural blueprint. GPS technology had pinpointed the location of each socket to within centimeters. The team had then connected these points, creating a digital model of the foundation structure. The resulting shape was a rectangle. Exodus 27:9-18 contains detailed specifications for the tabernacle courtyard. The biblical text uses the standard cubit, the common measurement used throughout the ancient Near East during the Bronze Age. This standard cubit measured approximately 45.7 centimeters. The Exodus passage specifies that the tabernacle courtyard should measure 100 cubits in length and 50 cubits in width. 100 cubits converts to approximately 45.7 meters. 50 cubits converts to approximately 22.85 meters. These aren't round numbers in modern measurements. They're oddly specific, but they do correspond to something very precise about the ancient cubit system. When the excavation team measured the distance between the outermost stone sockets they'd discovered, they found a length of approximately 45 to 47 meters and a width of approximately 22 to 24 meters. The variance accounted for natural erosion, soil settling, and the difficulty of achieving absolute precision when working with 3,000-year-old stone. But the central measurements matched the Exodus specifications almost exactly. The foundation was 100 cubits by 50 cubits, exactly as the text described. The biblical text doesn't just specify the outer dimensions of the tabernacle courtyard. It also specifies internal divisions. The text describes where the altar should be positioned, where the laver should stand, where the tabernacle tent itself should be located within the courtyard. The excavation team created a digital overlay. They took the biblical specifications for the internal layout and mapped them onto the stone socket foundation they'd discovered. What they found was geometric confirmation. The stone sockets weren't randomly distributed across the perimeter. They were positioned in clusters that corresponded exactly to where structural stress would be greatest, if you were building a rectangular structure with the internal divisions specified in Exodus. The biblical text describes the tabernacle entrance as being centered on the eastern side of the courtyard. The text also specifies that the altar should be positioned a specific distance from the entrance, measured in cubits. When the excavation team calculated where these features should be located based on Exodus specifications, and then compared those calculations to the actual stone socket positions, they found perfect alignment. The entrance was centered on the eastern side. The altar position corresponded exactly to the distance specified in the biblical text. The internal sockets marked out the exact spatial divisions described in ancient scripture. It wasn't approximate. It wasn't close. It was precise geometric correspondence. One of the most striking geometric discoveries involved the altar area specifically. The biblical text describes the altar of burnt offering as a square structure. It provides the exact dimensions, 5 cubits by 5 cubits. At Shiloh, within the perimeter defined by the outer stone sockets, the excavation team found evidence of a concentrated rectangular area where sacrificial bone remains were most densely concentrated. The dimensions of this area measured approximately 2.3 meters by 2.3 meters. A 5-cubit square, measured in modern terms, equals approximately 2.3 meters by 2.3 meters. This wasn't just a place where bones had been found. It was a defined space, an architectural unit, where the physical evidence of sacrifice concentrated precisely where the biblical text said the altar should stand. In the biblical description, the altar is positioned at the center of the courtyard, but offset toward the western side. The entrance is to the east. This creates a specific spatial relationship. If a priest stood at the entrance and looked into the courtyard, the altar would be visible but positioned at a calculated distance ahead and slightly to the side. At Shiloh, the actual stone socket positions replicated this exact spatial relationship. If you stood at the eastern entrance points and looked into the courtyard, the evidence of the altar area lay at precisely the distance and offset specified in the biblical text. Someone 3,000 years ago had designed this space with intentional geometric precision, and that precision matched exactly what an ancient text had specified. This level of geometric precision raises a critical question that the academic community couldn't avoid. How did an ancient text achieve such accurate measurements? There are only a few possibilities. First, the author of Exodus stood at Shiloh and measured the actual structure, recording precise dimensions for posterity. Second, The author of Exodus possessed knowledge of the structure's design before it was built and described the planned measurements. Third, the measurements in the biblical text are coincidental alignments with random stone socket placement. The third option becomes statistically untenable when you factor in all the variables. The likelihood of multiple independent measurements, spatial relationships, and geometric proportions aligning by chance approaches zero. The first two options suggest something the academic establishment had dismissed for decades. The biblical text was recording historical reality with precision and accuracy. One archaeologist involved in the analysis described the moment of realization this way: when you're working with measurements accurate to within centimeters, across multiple architectural features, across different types of evidence, spanning 3,000 years of time, you're not looking at coincidence anymore. You're looking at design. Someone knew exactly what they were describing. They recorded it with precision, and that precision survived 3,000 years to be vindicated by the ground. The measurements had spoken, and they had told a story that rewrote history. History is being rewritten, not by revisionists, not by those with agendas, but by evidence, by what the ground reveals when we stop assuming it will contradict ancient texts and actually listen to what it's saying. The Shiloh discovery represents a threshold moment, a point where enough evidence has accumulated that the old standard for evaluating ancient texts becomes untenable. The question is no longer whether ancient texts can be historically reliable. Shiloh proves they can be. The question is now, how should we evaluate which ancient texts are reliable? For 70 years, the standard was simple: assume biblical narratives are unreliable unless independently confirmed by archaeology. This created a methodology that was essentially backwards. It asked archaeologists to prove a negative. It demanded that every detail in a text be confirmed before any of it could be trusted. It operated from the premise that ancient texts were guilty until proven innocent. Shiloh changes this calculus. When a text provides specific measurements, and those measurements match physical evidence to within centimeters across multiple features. When a text describes an architectural layout, and that layout corresponds precisely to stone socket positions in the ground. When a text specifies religious protocols, and those protocols are validated by bone evidence and artifact patterns. When a text places a site in a geographical context, and that context matches actual topography and regional relationships. At that point, you're not looking at a text that needs to prove its reliability. You're looking at a text that has demonstrated its reliability. The new standard emerging from Shiloh scholarship asks a different question. What does reliable ancient historical writing look like? The answer, validated by evidence, includes precise measurement and architectural specification. Ancient writers who actually observed structures could record exact dimensions. Mythological accounts typically don't include specific measurements. Shiloh's measurements suggest someone was recording observed reality. Consistency across independent sources. The Shiloh narrative appears in multiple biblical books, from different authors, different time periods, different perspectives. Yet the core facts remain consistent. This redundancy suggests transmitted historical memory rather than invented fiction. Incidental geographical accuracy. Texts written by people inventing stories tend to simplify geography. Texts written by people describing places they know include specific details about terrain, water sources, accessibility. The Shiloh narratives include these incidental details that match actual geography. Correspondence between text description and material evidence. The types of bones found match the animals specified in religious law. The ritual storage patterns match described protocols. The destruction layer matches described historical events. Point by point, descriptions and evidence align. These criteria create something archaeologists had been searching for: a validation model. Shiloh provides a proven example of ancient text containing historically reliable information. That example can be used as a standard for evaluating other ancient texts. Other biblical sites that scholars had dismissed as legendary are now being reconsidered. The Pool of Siloam has been archaeologically confirmed. The House of David inscription is now accepted as historical documentation. Various biblical place names that scholars couldn't locate are now being identified through careful archaeological survey. The new standard says, "Don't dismiss a biblical reference just because you haven't found it yet." The Shiloh discovery proves that important sites can remain hidden for millennia. The absence of confirmation doesn't prove non-existence. The global scientific community's reaction has been cautious but unmistakable. Major archaeological journals that spent decades dismissing biblical references are now publishing papers treating biblical narratives as legitimate historical sources. Universities are quietly revising curricula. Scholars who built reputations on the unreliability of biblical texts are facing the uncomfortable reality that their fundamental premise was wrong. The default position is changing from "the Bible is unreliable until proven otherwise" to "the Bible may contain reliable historical information that should be evaluated against evidence rather than dismissed based on prior skepticism." What makes this shift particularly significant is how it affects the interpretation of biblical passages that haven't yet been archaeologically confirmed. Previously, scholars could dismiss these passages based on general skepticism about biblical reliability. The text makes this claim, but we haven't found archaeological confirmation, and we know biblical narratives are often unreliable, so this is probably legendary. Now, with Shiloh validating biblical historical recording, scholars have to reconsider that reasoning. The text makes this claim. We haven't found archaeological confirmation yet, but we now know that biblical narratives can contain precise historical information, recorded with sophistication. Should we dismiss this, or should we continue investigating? The burden of proof has shifted. The Shiloh discovery was creating a new historical paradigm. Not a paradigm that accepted every ancient text uncritically. Not a paradigm that abandoned scholarly standards of evidence, but a paradigm that treated ancient texts as potentially reliable historical sources that should be evaluated against evidence, rather than dismissed based on preconceived skepticism. This paradigm shift would have implications far beyond Shiloh. It would affect how scholars approached biblical texts about other sites, other historical figures, other events. It would reshape the entire discipline of ancient history. The excavation at Shiloh has validated the biblical account of a real sanctuary, real rituals, real historical events, spanning 300 years. But it has also raised questions that the ground has not yet answered. The Ark of the Covenant left Shiloh around 1050 BCE. The biblical text traces its journey, carried into battle against the Philistines, captured, moved to Beth Shemesh, transferred to Kiriath Jearim, eventually brought to Jerusalem by King David, placed in Solomon's temple, and then it vanishes. Not gradually, not through a documented process of decay or destruction, but completely, suddenly, totally absent from historical record. When the Babylonians destroyed Solomon's temple in 586 BCE, the Ark is never mentioned. 3,000 years of silence. If Shiloh is real, and we now know it is, if the sanctuary existed exactly as described, if the rituals were conducted precisely as specified, if the architectural details match to the centimeter, then where is the Ark? At Shiloh, archaeologists discovered something in the most recent excavation season that hasn't been fully analyzed yet. Deep within the excavation, beneath layers of ash and destruction debris, the team found sealed stone chambers. Not pottery vessels, but chambers cut into bedrock itself, deliberately sealed, positioned beneath the central sanctuary structure where the Ark would have rested during Shiloh's active period. These chambers have not been opened. The excavation team photographed them. They documented their position. They noted their construction. But they halted the excavation before breaching the seal. According to reports that have circulated through archaeological networks, ground-penetrating radar scans of these chambers show anomalies. Something is inside them. Something metal, based on the radar signature. Something of significant size, based on the spatial displacement. But what? The excavation team has been deliberately vague about these chambers. The official reports describe them as interesting architectural features requiring further study. But the specifics remain confidential. The chambers remain sealed. There's also something else from Shiloh that hasn't been fully revealed. The fragment with early Hebrew script that was discovered in the most recent excavation season, the fragment that researchers said would represent one of the most significant epigraphic finds from an Israelite site. That analysis is still ongoing. The research team has remained silent about what the inscription says, who wrote it, when it was written, what it documents. They've only said that the analysis is continuing and that more information will be released when complete. But the delays suggest something significant. The excavation at Shiloh is ongoing. New excavation seasons are planned. Deeper access to unexplored areas has been approved. Advanced technology is being employed to understand layers that previous seasons couldn't fully interpret. There are sections of the site that have never been systematically excavated. Areas where ground-penetrating radar has detected anomalies that remain unexplained. Zones beneath later occupation layers that could contain preservation-critical material. What's down there? Nobody knows yet. But here's what's significant. For 70 years, mainstream academia said nothing important would be found at Shiloh. The site was dismissed. The biblical narrative was discredited. The search was abandoned. Then everything changed. A new team, new methodology, new technology, and suddenly the ground began revealing what it had been holding for 3,000 years. Which raises an obvious question. What else is the ground holding that we've stopped looking for? The Ark of the Covenant has been missing for 2,600 years. The biblical text traced its journey. Archaeological evidence at Shiloh proves the journey's starting point was real. Subsequent locations mentioned in the text are being reconsidered with new seriousness. But the final destination remains unknown. Some scholars believe it's hidden somewhere awaiting discovery. Others believe it was destroyed. Others believe it exists in a location so politically sensitive that its discovery would trigger international conflict. The sealed chambers at Shiloh might contain answers. The unreleased Hebrew inscription might contain documentation. The sections of the site yet to be excavated might reveal something. Or they might not. What we know for certain is this. The biblical account of Shiloh has been validated. The sanctuary was real. The structures were precisely described. The rituals matched the evidence. The history was accurately recorded. Which means the biblical account of the Ark, from its presence at Shiloh, through its removal, its journey, and its placement in the temple, is grounded in historical reality rather than legendary fiction, which means the Ark might exist somewhere, not as religious relic, not as mystical object, but as physical artifact, as historical evidence, as something that can be found. The excavation continues. The sealed chambers remain closed. The Hebrew inscription sits in a laboratory, awaiting final analysis. The ground continues to hold its secrets. And somewhere, in the dust and stone and earth, the answer might be waiting. The question is not whether these secrets will eventually be revealed. The question is, who will be watching when they are?